1 million people dead, you're getting rich. 1 million people dead, you're using federal employees to get cash awards for you. 1 million people dead, and you're here taking the fifth because you don't want to admit that what really happened in all that time was a multi-month, multi-year course of self-dealing. Isn't that true, Dr. Fauci?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
You may have been a good public servant at one time, I don't know. But what I can tell you from reading your emails now, from looking at what you did, how you used your employees, somewhere along the line, it became all about you. You became a narcissist and a megalomaniac and a liar. And you've lied to the American people, and you've lied to this body. And you've disgraced your profession by doing it. You called yourself the most famous scientist in the world. You've done more to harm science than anybody in my lifetime. And I hope you'll go home and write that in your diary.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Congress Daily Report, your trusted channel for real, raw, and unapologetic political breakdowns. Today, Senator Josh Hawley puts Dr. Anthony Fauci under intense pressure over his pandemic-era actions, federal employees, and controversial cash awards. Like, share, and subscribe, and watch until the end because this confrontation gets heated. Let's get into it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, nothing says honesty like taking the fifth, huh, Doc? Let's try something. What day of the week is it today?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
What color tie are you wearing?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
What color's the carpet in front of you?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Let's just get one thing straight. You don't have any rights under the Fifth Amendment because you've been pardoned, as you very well know. As the Supreme Court has been clear for a century and more, Brown versus Walker, 1896, when he has been pardoned, he may not stand upon his privilege. You know that. Your lawyers sitting behind you now shifting nervously in their chairs, they know it. This isn't about the Constitution. This isn't about the law. This is about contempt. Contempt for this body and contempt for the American people. But I think I know why you're doing it. It's because you don't want to answer questions. It's because you did all kinds of terrible things. It's because during the pandemic you got rich, didn't you? You got rich while people were dying, hundreds of thousands of Americans, over 1 million in the end, and you were getting rich, and not only were you doing that, you were using federal employees with taxpayer money to apply for and solicit cash prizes for you personally, cash prizes totaling over $1 million. You did all of that during the pandemic, didn't you? That's a question.
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
You remember Greg Folkers? Who was that?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Your chief of staff is the answer. Do you remember Patricia Conrad? Who was that?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
She was your personal assistant. And what were these individuals doing in the depth of the pandemic in November of 2020 when millions of Americans were suffering from COVID? What were they doing? I tell you what they're doing. Folkers was on your behalf soliciting and gathering information for a cash award. Let's look at it. We've got his email right here, right over my shoulder. Folkers says, I'm working on this nomination for the Dan David Award for Fauci. We need to beef up the COVID part. Do you have language in the can that you could share that delineates how we responded in new ways to COVID? He sends this to multiple federal employees. What was the Dan David Award? Do you remember, Doc?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
It was a $900,000 cash award. $900,000 cash award. And he got it because he used federal employees to get it. And this wasn't the only award, was it, Dr. Fauci? In fact, you applied for and received at least 8 other federal cash prizes on federal time using federal employees and federal resources. Here they are over my shoulder. Besides the Dan David Award, you've got the Partnership for Public Service, you've got the Adelson Prize, you've got the Smithsonian Award, you've got the National Academy of Medicine's Award, you've got the CDC Foundation. In fact, you turned your staff into a full-time application machine. You actually wrote to people and said, do you think maybe I'd qualify? And you got cash for all of this. And it wasn't just 1 or 2 employees, was it? In fact, you used 8 separate federal employees on federal time using federal resources to solicit cash awards. Isn't that true?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Here they are right over my shoulder. Here's all of them. The people that you use, federal employees, so that you could go and get cash money. And the most hilarious part is that you weren't content to even dragoon them into applying for all of these cash awards. You then had them go out to the ethics agencies and ethics watchdogs and demand that you be able to get the money. That's right. We've got it in your emails. Your staff and employees on federal time, using federal resources, being paid with federal dollars, are soliciting cash for you, and then they're turning around and saying to the agency, we don't want just an answer, we want to get to yes, because Fauci wants the money. He wants it. We want to get to yes, and yes takes time. This is your chief of staff again, using federal email to pressure the agency's own ethics people so that you could get money, so that you could get rich. And it violated the law, didn't it, Dr. Fauci? Didn't it? It violated the law, didn't it? It is a question. You can answer. Go ahead.
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Federal law, as you very well know, prohibits the solicitation of cash awards or other personal benefits for federal employees. And it certainly prohibits using your own employees to do this. 5 CFR section 2635-205B, it says it right there in black and white. You cannot use federal resources, federal dollars, federal employees, federal offices, federal email, federal time to solicit cash awards, and you did all of it, and the worst part is thousands of people were dying while you were doing it. You were supposed to be the nation's doctor, and you were playing one on TV, but this is what you were doing with your time. Isn't that true?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Yeah, I can see why. I can certainly see why. You know what I can't quite figure out is that why you were so obsessed with it, because you're already rich. I mean, and your scheme worked here. I mean, your net worth now is north of $12 million. You got over $1 million in cash awards during COVID, during a 12-month, 24-month span during COVID. $1 million you knocked down in cash money using federal resources. Now you're worth more than $12 million. You've got a pension that in its first year paid out north of $400,000 a year. 1 million people dead, you're getting rich. 1 million people dead, you're using federal employees to get cash awards for you. 1 million people dead, and you're here taking the fifth because you don't want to admit that what really happened in all that time was a multi-month, multi-year course of self-dealing. Isn't that true, Dr. Fauci?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Yeah, well, silence is admission. And here's the real thing. At the end of the day, it wasn't just about the money, really, was it? It was really about a power trip. I mean, through all of this, you want to be the most famous scientist in the world. You were so focused on getting every award and every drop of cash that you could, all because you wanted to be on TV. You wanted to be the sun god of science. You wanted to be the guy who was in charge of it all. You wanted to lambast Trump. You wanted to make sure that nobody else stole your spotlight. You wanted to be the guy. You had time to sit for InStyle magazine. Here's what you were doing with your time. You could sit for InStyle magazine, but you can't answer questions for the American people. You could sit for InStyle magazine, but you're here taking the fifth. You could sit for InStyle magazine and get $1 million in cash awards, but now the cat's got your tongue. I bet he does. I tell you what, here's my conclusion from all of this. This was really all about you the whole time. Somewhere along the way, you lost your way. You may have been a good public servant at one time, I don't know. But I can tell you from reading your emails now, from looking at what you did, how you used your employees, somewhere along the line, it became all about you. You became a narcissist and a megalomaniac and a liar. And you've lied to the American people, and you've lied to this body. And you've disgraced your profession by doing it. You called yourself the most famous scientist in the world. You've done more to harm science than anybody in my lifetime. And I hope you'll go home and write that in your diary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Fetterman.
Well, folks, this was not your typical congressional exchange. Senator Josh Hawley came into this hearing with a very specific strategy. He wasn't simply asking Dr. Anthony Fauci about COVID policy. He was going after something much more personal and much more consequential: allegations concerning money, awards, federal employees, government resources, and whether Fauci's position gave him access to benefits that ordinary Americans could never have received. And right from the beginning, Hawley made it clear that he wasn't interested in allowing this hearing to become another carefully controlled Washington conversation. He wanted answers. And Fauci's response? Again and again, he invoked the Fifth Amendment. That's where the exchange immediately became explosive. Hawley starts with the Fifth Amendment. Hawley began by making a sarcastic point. He asked Fauci something incredibly simple. What day of the week is it? Fauci declined to answer, saying that on the advice of counsel, he respectfully declined to answer based upon his Fifth Amendment rights. Then Hawley asked what colored tie Fauci was wearing. Same answer. Then he asked about the color of the carpet. Again, Fauci invoked the Fifth. Now, let's pause right there. Obviously, Hawley wasn't genuinely trying to discover what day it was or what color the carpet was. He was making a political and legal point. He was demonstrating just how broadly Fauci was refusing to answer questions. And Hawley clearly wanted the audience watching this hearing to understand exactly how unusual the situation appeared to him. The pardon question. Then Hawley moved into a much more serious argument. He claimed that Fauci's pardon affected his ability to invoke the Fifth Amendment, pointing to historical Supreme Court precedent. That's an important legal claim, but it should be treated as Hawley's argument, not automatically as a settled conclusion simply because it was stated during a hearing. The Fifth Amendment and immunity or pardon issues can involve complicated legal questions. And that's something viewers should understand. Congressional hearings can involve lawyers making arguments from both sides, and a senator's interpretation is not necessarily the final word of a court. But politically, Hawley was making a very simple argument. If Fauci had nothing to hide, why wouldn't he answer? And that question became the central theme of the confrontation. This is about contempt. Hawley then turned up the pressure. He accused Fauci of showing contempt toward Congress and toward the American people. That's a powerful accusation. But here's what made the exchange particularly interesting. Hawley wasn't only talking about COVID policy. He was talking about what he characterized as personal financial benefits and awards received during the pandemic era. And that's where the hearing moved into much more controversial territory: the cash award allegations. Hawley alleged that Fauci became financially successful while the country was going through an unprecedented crisis. He then connected those financial claims to federal employees, who, according to Hawley's presentation, helped prepare or support applications for awards on Fauci's behalf. One of the awards Hawley focused heavily on was the Dan David Prize, which he described as a $900,000 cash award. Hawley presented emails that he said showed members of Fauci's staff working on the nomination. That's the part that deserves serious attention. Because if federal employees were actually using government time and government resources to pursue personal benefits for a government official, that's a legitimate oversight question. The issue isn't whether someone deserves recognition for their professional achievements. The issue is how that recognition was pursued. Were government employees performing legitimate government duties? Or were they being used for personal purposes? Those are very different things. And if there were violations of federal ethics rules, then Congress has every right to investigate. But again, Viewers should distinguish between an allegation presented at a hearing and a final legal finding. The award machine argument. Hawley went even further. He claimed Fauci's staff had pursued multiple awards on his behalf. He referenced several organizations and awards and argued that multiple federal employees had been involved. Hawley's description was essentially this. Instead of government employees spending their time solely on government business, they were allegedly helping a senior government official build nominations for personal recognition and financial awards. That's a serious allegation, and this is where I believe congressional oversight becomes important. It doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat, Republican, doctor, scientist, military official, cabinet secretary, or agency director. If taxpayer-funded employees are being used for personal benefit, the American people deserve answers. That's not a partisan principle. That's a government accountability principle. What makes this so controversial? Think about the optics. During COVID, millions of Americans were dealing with sickness, job losses, business closures, economic uncertainty, and enormous disruption to everyday life. At the same time, America's most recognizable public health officials became some of the most powerful voices in the country. They appeared on television. They testified before Congress. They advised presidents. They influenced public policy. They became household names. And that enormous influence created an equally enormous responsibility. With that kind of power comes scrutiny. And that's exactly what Hawley was bringing into this hearing. But let's be fair about one thing. Now, this is where I want to slow down, because political commentary should not turn into a courtroom where accusations automatically become convictions. Hawley made some extremely serious claims. Fauci repeatedly declined to answer those questions, citing his legal counsel and the Fifth Amendment. That means the transcript itself does not establish every allegation as fact. That's important. If there are questions about awards, federal resources, ethics rules, or government employees, those questions should be investigated through documents, audits, ethics reviews, and appropriate legal proceedings. That's how accountability should work, not through social media outrage, not through partisan shouting, through evidence. The federal employee issue. But the central question remains, could federal employees legally and appropriately assist a senior government official in pursuing personal awards? That's something worth examining, because taxpayers don't pay federal employees to become someone's personal public relations team. Government workers are supposed to perform government business. If someone is using government staff, government email, government computers, or government time for personal financial benefit, that creates an obvious ethics question. And if the conduct was completely legitimate, then the documentation should be able to demonstrate that. That's the beauty of transparency. If everything was appropriate, show the records. If everything wasn't appropriate, hold people accountable. Hawley also goes after Fauci's wealth. Then Hawley went after Fauci's financial position. He cited figures concerning Fauci's reported net worth, his pension, and the value of awards. Again, these numbers and Hawley's characterization should be independently verified rather than treated as established, simply because they were mentioned during the hearing. But politically, Hawley's argument was obvious. He was asking, why was someone who was already financially successful allegedly pursuing additional cash awards using government employees? That is the question he wanted Americans to think about. And frankly, it's a reasonable question to investigate. The bigger issue, trust. But here's where this hearing goes beyond Josh Hawley versus Anthony Fauci. The real issue is public trust. During the pandemic, Americans were asked to trust experts, trust government agencies, trust public health officials, trust changing guidance, trust institutions, and millions of Americans did. But whenever officials exercise extraordinary power, they have to understand that the public is going to demand extraordinary accountability afterward. That's not anti-science. That's not anti-government. That's democracy. Public institutions survive because people believe those institutions are operating honestly. When that trust disappears, rebuilding it becomes incredibly difficult. GLASP discussions about Fauci's pandemic role similarly emphasize how much scrutiny surrounded his public health decisions and how deeply the pandemic affected trust in health institutions. The media spotlight. Another part of Hawley's argument involved Fauci's media appearances. Hawley pointed to Fauci participating in interviews and appearing in publications while simultaneously facing congressional questioning. Hawley used that contrast rhetorically. His argument was basically, if you had time for media appearances and public recognition, why couldn't you answer Congress? Now, those activities aren't automatically contradictory. Public officials and scientists can communicate with the public while also dealing with congressional oversight. But Hawley's broader point was about priorities. When you're using the authority of the federal government, Americans expect you to be accountable to the institutions overseeing that government. The pandemic cannot become an accountability-free zone, and this is one of the strongest points I take from the hearing. COVID was an extraordinary event, but extraordinary circumstances don't eliminate the need for accountability. In fact, they make accountability even more important. During a crisis, government officials receive extraordinary authority. Decisions can affect schools, businesses, hospitals, travel, employment, public gatherings, and individual freedoms. That level of power must come with transparency. You cannot tell Americans, trust us because this is an emergency, and then years later, expect those same Americans not to ask questions about what happened behind the scenes. That's not how a constitutional republic is supposed to function. Fauci's silence became the story, and whether you agree with Hawley's political style or not, there's no question that Fauci's repeated refusal to answer became the dominant visual of the exchange. Hawley asks, Fauci declines. Hawley asks again. Fauci declines again. And the pattern continues. From Hawley's perspective, that was exactly what he wanted the American public to see. He wanted people watching to conclude that Fauci wasn't willing to defend himself. But here's the important distinction. Silence is not automatically proof of guilt. A person invoking a constitutional protection is not automatically admitting wrongdoing. That's an important legal principle. However, from a political standpoint, repeated refusal to answer questions can still create suspicion and damage public confidence. Those are two separate issues. My take as a conservative. Here's where I stand. I believe government officials should be held to a higher standard, not because they're Republicans, not because they're Democrats, not because they're scientists, not because they're doctors, because they're public servants. If you work for the federal government, taxpayer resources aren't your personal property. Federal employees aren't your personal assistants. Government email isn't your personal business account. And taxpayer-funded time isn't something you should casually use for private benefit. If Hawley's allegations are accurate, then the conduct deserves serious scrutiny. And if they're inaccurate, then the evidence should establish that too. Either way, the American people deserve the truth. But don't turn this into an attack on science. There's another point I want to make. Criticizing Fauci does not mean criticizing every doctor. It doesn't mean rejecting science. It doesn't mean rejecting medical research. It doesn't mean believing every conspiracy theory that appears online. Those are completely different things. You can believe in science and still believe scientists working for the government should be accountable. You can respect doctors and still question government policy. You can support medical research and still demand transparency about taxpayer money. In fact, that's exactly how a healthy democracy should operate. Science should be based on evidence. Government should be based on law. And public officials should be based on accountability. What should happen next? If these allegations are serious enough to bring before Congress, then they should be investigated properly. Show the emails. Show the award applications. Show who performed the work. Show whether employees were on federal time. Show whether government resources were used. Show what ethics officials said. Show what rules applied. And if the conduct was legal, explain why. If it was improper, determine who was responsible. That's the process Americans deserve. No political party should be above that process. The bigger lesson. The biggest lesson from this hearing isn't simply about Fauci. It's about the relationship between government power and accountability. During a crisis, Americans need competent leadership, but they also need leaders who understand that they work for the public. The government doesn't belong to individual officials. The agencies don't belong to agency heads. And taxpayer money doesn't belong to Washington bureaucrats. It belongs to the American people. That's why oversight matters. That's why congressional hearings matter. And that's why difficult questions need to be asked. Final thoughts. Folks, this hearing was intense. Senator Josh Hawley came prepared to challenge Dr. Anthony Fauci over allegations concerning federal employees, awards, government resources, and financial benefits. Fauci repeatedly declined to answer the substance of Hawley's questions, citing the Fifth Amendment and the advice of counsel. But here's the key point. Congressional allegations are not the same thing as a final legal finding. The proper response is investigation, evidence, transparency, and accountability. If nothing improper happened, prove it. If something improper happened, hold the responsible people accountable. That's the standard I believe every American deserves. And here's the question I want to leave you with. Do you believe Senator Hawley raised legitimate questions that deserve a full investigation, or do you believe his confrontation went too far? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you believe government officials should always be accountable to the American people, make sure you like this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to Congress Daily Report. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next political breakdown. Thanks for watching Congress Daily Report. Stay informed, stay engaged, and I'll see you in the next report.